Picture this. It's October 28th, 1943. You're a sailor on a merchant vessel called the USS Andrew Furuseth, anchored in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. You're taking a break on deck, smoking a cigarette, watching the usual wartime chaos of workers, cranes, and naval vessels. Then you see something that makes you drop that cigarette and question your sanity for the rest of your life. There's a destroyer escort docked about 300 yards away, the USS Eldridge. You've seen it before, nothing special. Just another one of those cannon-class ships they're churning out to fight the U-boats. But today, something's different. The whole ship is wrapped in massive electrical cables, like someone's gift wrapping a warship with copper wire. Weird. But you've seen weirder things in wartime. Then, the humming starts. It's low at first, almost below hearing, vibrating in your chest, like standing too close to a power transformer. The air smells like ozone, that sharp metallic scent you get right before a lightning storm. The Eldridge starts to glow, not like lights turning on, but like the whole ship is becoming luminescent from within. A sickly, greenish color that makes your eyes water. And then it happens. The ship begins to fade. Not like it's sailing away or being covered by fog. It's becoming transparent, like someone's adjusting the opacity slider on reality itself. You can see through the hull to the water behind it, through the superstructure to the buildings beyond. The entire 1,200-ton destroyer is turning into a ghost. Your knees buckle. You're gripping the railing so hard your knuckles are white. This isn't possible. Ships don't just vanish. But you're watching it happen. The Eldridge is now barely visible, a shimmering outline, like heat waves on summer asphalt. And then, in a flash of blinding green light, it's gone. Completely gone. Just empty water where a warship used to be. You stand there, mouth open, heart hammering. Did that really just happen? Did the United States Navy just make a ship disappear? And if they did, what the hell were they trying to do? And what went wrong? Because here's the thing. According to the stories that would emerge years later, something did go horribly, catastrophically wrong. Sailors materialized, with their bodies fused into the steel bulkheads, screaming in agony. Men went insane, their minds shattered by whatever they'd experienced. Some burst into flames during shore leave. Others became stuck between dimensions, flickering in and out of visibility like a bad television signal. The Philadelphia experiment, as it would come to be known, represents one of the most persistent and controversial military legends of the 20th century. Was it a revolutionary breakthrough in physics that the government covered up? An elaborate hoax perpetrated by a troubled drifter? Or something in between? A real experiment that got wildly exaggerated through decades of conspiracy theories and science fiction. For the next hour, we're going to dive deep into this story. We'll examine the science, the witnesses, the contradictions, and the unanswered questions. We'll look at Nikola Tesla's mysterious final projects, the desperate measures of World War II naval warfare, and the fine line between cutting-edge research and impossible fantasy. Here's the question that's haunted researchers for 80 years. Did the United States Navy accidentally crack the code to invisibility and teleportation in 1943? And if they did, what happened to the men who were on that ship? Before we go any further, if you're into stories about secret military experiments, impossible physics, and government cover-ups that might actually be true, hit that subscribe button. Seriously, we dig into these kinds of historical mysteries all the time. And let me know in the comments if you'd heard about the Philadelphia experiment before watching this, because this story has been circulating for decades, and I'm curious how many of you came in knowing nothing versus thinking you knew everything. Alright, so to understand why this story has any credibility at all, we need to understand what was happening in 1943. And I'm not talking about D-Day or the Pacific Theater. I'm talking about the absolute nightmare that was the Battle of the Atlantic. Think of it this way. Britain is that friend who's about to lose everything. German U-boats are sinking cargo ships faster than the Allies can build them. We're talking hundreds of ships going down, thousands of sailors drowning in icy water. And if it continues, Britain will literally starve or surrender. The entire war effort depends on getting supplies across the Atlantic, and German submarines are turning those supply routes into graveyards. Now, the Germans had gotten really creative with how they were sinking ships. Torpedoes, sure, but also magnetic mines. These things were diabolical. They'd sit on the ocean floor, completely invisible, waiting for a ship to pass overhead. When they detected the ship's magnetic signature, basically the giant metal hull creating a magnetic field, boom. The mine would detonate, ripping the ship apart from below. So the Navy needed a solution, and fast. They developed something called degaussing. Stay with me because this is important for understanding what might have actually happened on the Eldridge. Degaussing is basically wrapping your ship in electrical cables and running current through them to neutralize the ship's magnetic signature. It's like making your ship magnetically invisible to those mines. This was real technology, documented standard equipment on World War II naval vessels. But here's where it gets interesting. If you can make a ship invisible to magnetic detection, what else could you make it invisible to? Radar was the new hot technology. The British had it, the Germans were developing it, and whoever mastered radar detection and radar evasion would have a massive advantage. Making a ship disappear from radar screens would be like having stealth bombers in World War II. The Naval Research Laboratory in 1943 was basically running at full capacity, working on everything from radar to sonar to radio communications. They had unlimited funding, minimal oversight, and the pressure of knowing that every failed experiment meant more dead sailors. It was the perfect environment for both revolutionary breakthroughs and catastrophic failures. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where this allegedly happened, was massive. Over 40,000 workers at its peak, building destroyers, battleships, and submarines around the clock. Security was tight but not impossible to breach. Compartmentalization meant that workers in one section had no idea what was happening 3 buildings over. If you wanted to run a secret experiment, this was the place to do it. Countries were competing like their lives depended on it, because they did. Britain was already losing. The United States was trying to ramp up fast enough to matter. Germany had a head start on rocket technology, jet engines, and advanced U-boats. It was like a brutal startup race, but instead of apps and venture capital, you had weapon systems and body counts. So the stage is set, desperate times, unlimited resources, cutting-edge electromagnetic research, and a naval shipyard where nobody asks too many questions. The perfect conditions for either a breakthrough or a disaster, or both. To understand the science behind the Philadelphia experiment claims, we need to talk about the man whose name keeps appearing in the conspiracy theories, Nikola Tesla. And before you roll your eyes about another Tesla story, hear me out, because the timing here is genuinely suspicious. Tesla died on January 7th, 1943, not peacefully in his sleep surrounded by loved ones, but alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker hotel, broke, eccentric, and reportedly working on secret projects for the United States military. Let's rewind. Tesla in the 1880s and 90s was basically Elon Musk, if Elon Musk actually invented the things he claimed to invent. Alternating current electrical systems, rotating magnetic fields, radio technology, remote control, the Tesla coil. This guy fundamentally changed how electricity works in modern civilization, but by the 1940s, he'd become that brilliant friend who's maybe losing it a bit. He was obsessed with wireless power transmission. Not like wireless charging for your phone, but beaming electricity through the air across continents. He talked about death rays and force fields. He claimed to have invented a weapon so powerful it could destroy 10,000 aircraft from 200 miles away. People thought he was crazy. The FBI thought he might be dangerous. Here's what we know for certain. Tesla did consult for the United States military during World War II. He proposed several weapon systems. After his death, the FBI seized all his papers and personal effects within hours. They classified them as sensitive materials related to national defense. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented fact. The FBI's own files confirm it. Now, Tesla's specialty was electromagnetic fields. Rotating magnetic fields specifically. The same technology that makes electric motors work. He understood that if you could generate powerful enough electromagnetic fields in the right configuration, you could do some pretty weird things. Wireless power, radio waves, X-rays. Who knows what else? The Philadelphia experiment claims revolve around the idea that Tesla, in his final years, figured out how to use massive electromagnetic generators to bend light around an object, make it invisible. The theory goes that he shared this research with the Navy, who saw an opportunity to make their ships disappear from enemy radar, and possibly from visual detection. But there's a problem with this theory. Tesla died 10 months before the alleged experiment on October 28th. Could he have been consulting on the project before he died? Absolutely. Did the Navy take his unfinished research and try to implement it? Maybe. Did they succeed in something he couldn't? That's where the story gets wild. Tesla's rotating magnetic field principles are sound physics. They work. We use them every day in motors and generators. But scaling them up to the point where you could bend light around a 300-foot destroyer? That's not just scaling up. That's several breakthroughs in physics that we still haven't achieved 8 decades later. There are researchers who've studied Tesla's work extensively. Dr. James Coram, an electromagnetic engineer, has examined Tesla's papers and concluded that while Tesla understood electromagnetic theory better than almost anyone alive, there's no evidence he ever proposed anything resembling what the Philadelphia experiment describes. Tesla was working on beam weapons and particle accelerators, not invisibility cloaks. But here's the juicy part. We don't have all of Tesla's papers. The FBI seized them, classified them, and while some have been declassified, others remain hidden. The official explanation is that they contained sensitive weapons research. The unofficial explanation, depending on who you ask, is that they contained something far more revolutionary, something the government didn't want public. Tesla also had help, or so the story goes. Some versions of the Philadelphia experiment claim that Albert Einstein himself was involved, applying his unified field theory work to the problem of electromagnetic invisibility. Einstein was working on unified field theory in the 1940s, trying to unify gravity and electromagnetism into a single mathematical framework. He never succeeded. The theory remained unfinished at his death in 1955. But what if the Navy didn't need a complete unified field theory? What if they just needed enough to make a ship disappear for a few minutes? What if Einstein consulted, provided some equations, and they ran with it before understanding the consequences? There's no documented evidence Einstein ever visited Philadelphia Naval Shipyard or worked with the Navy on invisibility research. But there's also no evidence he didn't. His whereabouts during the war years aren't completely accounted for. He was working at Princeton, consulting on various projects. Could he have spent a few days in Philadelphia? It's possible. The problem with Tesla and Einstein being involved is that it makes the story sound more credible. A project combining the two greatest scientific minds of the era, funded by unlimited military resources, attempting the impossible. That's the kind of thing that could actually work, or fail spectacularly. But what nobody knew in 1943 was that even attempting something like this might break reality itself in ways nobody could predict. The USS Eldridge, hull number DE-173, was nothing special. A Cannon-class destroyer escort, one of hundreds being mass-produced to fight U-boats. Think of destroyer escorts as the economy class of warships, not heavy enough to slug it out with battleships, Not fast enough to run down submarines, just tough enough to escort merchant convoys and hope you don't run into anything serious. The Eldridge was commissioned on August 27, 1943, brand new. Fresh paint, new crew, ready for war. Displacement, 1,240 tons. Length, 306 feet. Crew, 186 men. Her captain was Sidney Sherby, and by all accounts, he was a solid officer, not someone who'd participate in crazy experiments that might kill his men. Here's the thing about naval crews in World War II. They were young. Average age was probably early 20s. Many had never seen the ocean before enlisting. They came from farms in Iowa, factories in Pennsylvania, shops in California. The Navy trained them fast, assigned them to ships, and sent them into combat zones. They trusted their officers, trusted their ship, and trusted that the Navy knew what it was doing. The official record shows the Eldridge spent October 1943 doing shakedown cruises in the Bermuda area. Shakedown cruises are basically test runs where you make sure everything works before heading into combat. Test the engines, test the guns, test the crew's ability to work together. Routine stuff. But according to the Philadelphia experiment story, something else was happening. The Eldridge wasn't just testing conventional systems. She was being fitted with massive electromagnetic generators, wound with cables that ran the entire length of the ship. The crew was told it was experimental degaussing equipment, protection against magnetic mines. Nothing to worry about. Imagine being one of those sailors. You're 20 years old, this is your first ship, and suddenly there are civilian contractors installing weird equipment you don't understand. Cables everywhere. Generators humming at frequencies that make your teeth ache. The officers are tight-lipped about what's really going on. You hear rumors, radar invisibility, secret weapons. But you're Navy, so you don't ask questions. You do your job. The crew would have noticed strange effects even during testing. Electrical equipment malfunctioning, compasses spinning wildly, that ozone smell that makes you think of lightning storms. Some versions of the story claim sailors reported feeling nauseous, dizzy, disoriented during test runs. But hey, you're on a ship. Seasickness is normal, right? Here's where the story diverges from documented reality. According to ship logs, the Eldridge was nowhere near Philadelphia on October the 28th, 1943. She was in the Bahamas. The deck logs show routine convoy escort duty. Nothing unusual, nothing classified. If the experiment happened, either the logs were altered, or the ship's officers falsified records, or the experiment happened on a different date that got mixed up over the years. But let's say the experiment did happen. Let's say the Navy pulled the Eldridge into Philadelphia for a few days, ran their test, then sent her back to the Bahamas and backdated the logs to cover the gap. It's not impossible. The Manhattan Project managed to hide an entire city-building atomic bombs. Falsifying a few days of ship logs would be child's play. The crew would have been briefed. National security. Top secret. Don't talk about what you see. Sign these papers. Your families will never know. If you talk, you go to military prison. That's how it worked. So they're assembled on deck. Maybe some are below decks, manning the experimental equipment. The generators start up. The humming begins. The captain gives the order to bring the system to full power. And then, if the story is true, reality broke. What the crew didn't know, what nobody could have known, is that they weren't just testing a degaussing system or a radar invisibility device. According to the allegations, they were about to participate in the most catastrophic physics experiment in human history, and some of them would pay for it with their sanity, their bodies, and their lives. All right, let's talk about what's actually possible versus what's complete fantasy, because understanding the science is crucial to figuring out if this could have happened at all. First, degaussing is real. It works. It's simple physics. Every ship has a magnetic signature because it's basically a giant hunk of steel floating in salt water. which creates electrical currents, which create magnetic fields. Magnetic mines detect that field and blow up. To counter this, you wrap cables around the ship's hull and run electrical current through them to create an opposing magnetic field that cancels out the ship's natural magnetism. Boom! You're invisible to magnetic mines. This technology was standard on Allied warships by 1943. It wasn't secret, wasn't experimental, wasn't dangerous. It was as normal as having a radio. So if the Eldridge was just testing degaussing equipment, there would be nothing mysterious about it. But making a ship invisible to radar? That's trickier, but still within the realm of physics. Radar works by bouncing radio waves off objects and detecting the reflection. If you could absorb or deflect those radio waves instead of reflecting them, you'd be invisible to radar. Modern stealth aircraft do exactly this using special shapes and materials. But in 1943? The materials science wasn't there. They didn't have radar-absorbing paint or special coatings. However, electromagnetic interference is a thing. If you generated a powerful enough electromagnetic field around a ship, you might be able to jam or confuse radar signals. Not make the ship invisible, but make it appear as static or interference on radar screens. That's theoretically possible with 1940s technology. You'd need huge generators, massive power consumption, and you'd probably fry every electrical system on the ship. But it's not impossible. Now, optical invisibility, making a ship actually disappear from sight, that's where we leave the realm of possible and enter pure science fiction. To make something invisible to the human eye, you need to bend light around it. Light travels in straight lines. To make it curve around an object requires either a gravitational field so powerful it bends space-time like a black hole, or a material with very specific optical properties that we call metamaterials. Metamaterials weren't even theorized until the 1960s. We've only successfully created them in laboratory conditions in the 21st century, and we're talking about making things the size of a hair invisible, not a 300-foot warship. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical. We're talking about power consumption equivalent to a small city, for maybe a few seconds of invisibility. But here's where the Philadelphia experiment story gets interesting. It doesn't claim they used metamaterials or gravitational fields. It claims they used electromagnetic fields. Specifically, a massive array of electromagnetic generators creating a rotating field envelope around the ship based on Tesla's rotating magnetic field principles. Tesla understood that rotating magnetic fields could do weird things. They can induce electrical currents in nearby conductors. They can create strange optical effects like the shimmering you see near high-voltage power lines. But bending light? No. Electromagnetic fields interact with charged particles, not photons. Light doesn't have electric charge, so electromagnetic fields don't directly affect it, unless you're working with Einstein's unified field theory. Einstein was trying to prove that electromagnetism and gravity are two aspects of the same fundamental force. If he'd succeeded, and if someone had figured out how to weaponize it, then theoretically, you might be able to use electromagnetic generators to create a pseudo-gravitational field that could bend light. But Einstein never finished that work. The math never worked out. Every attempt to unify electromagnetism and gravity using classical physics has failed. Quantum mechanics offers another possibility. The Casimir effect, discovered in 1948, shows that quantum vacuum fluctuations can create measurable forces between objects. Some theoretical physicists have proposed that manipulating these quantum vacuum states could allow for optical cloaking or even faster than light travel. But in 1943, nobody even knew about the Casimir effect. The theory didn't exist yet. So scientifically, making the Eldridge invisible to radar is plausible with 1940s technology. Though difficult, making it invisible to the human eye is impossible with 1940s technology unless they'd achieved a breakthrough in physics so fundamental that it would rewrite our understanding of reality, which is a hell of a claim. But wait, the story gets crazier. The Philadelphia experiment doesn't just claim invisibility, it claims teleportation. The ship allegedly disappeared from Philadelphia and reappeared simultaneously in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. Then it teleported back to Philadelphia. Teleportation violates so many physical laws, I don't even know where to start. Conservation of energy, conservation of information, the uncertainty principle, causality itself. To teleport a 1,200-ton warship, you'd need to map the quantum state of every single atom, transmit that information faster than light, and reconstruct the entire ship perfectly at the destination. We can barely teleport single photons in laboratory conditions in 2025. Doing it with a ship and crew in 1943? No, just no. Unless, and this is a big unless, they stumbled onto something we still don't understand. Some interaction between powerful electromagnetic fields and space-time that creates shortcuts through reality. Wormholes, dimensional rifts, whatever you want to call them. It's been theorized, but never demonstrated. And if it happened by accident on the Eldridge, it would explain why it was never repeated. They had no idea what they'd done or how to control it. The science says this is impossible. But science also said heavier-than-air flight was impossible until 1903. It said nuclear fission was impossible until 1939. It said landing on the moon was impossible until 1969. So the question isn't whether the Philadelphia experiment violates known physics. It does. The question is whether they accidentally discovered unknown physics. And that's where things get really interesting. So let's talk about the day itself. October 28th, 1943. According to the legend, this is when the main experiment took place. Some versions claim there was a previous test on July 22nd that achieved partial success, but October 28th was supposed to be the full demonstration. The USS Eldridge is docked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The experimental equipment is installed. The crew has been briefed, or at least told enough to get them to their stations. Observers are present, including allegedly high-ranking naval officers and possibly civilian scientists. Everyone knows this is important. Nobody knows it's about to go catastrophically wrong. According to witness testimony that would emerge years later, the experiment began in the morning. The generators were brought online gradually, building power over several hours. The electromagnetic field was carefully calibrated, monitored, adjusted. This wasn't a flip-a-switch kind of operation. This was precise control of enormous energy. The crew on deck would have felt it first. That humming vibration in your bones. The smell of ozone so thick you can taste it. Your hair standing on end from static electricity. Compasses spinning uselessly. Anyone wearing a metal watch would feel it heating up from induced currents. Then the visual effects began. According to the story, a greenish fog appeared around the ship. Not like regular fog, but luminescent, almost like the aurora borealis, but denser. This fog was reportedly generated by the ionization of air molecules in the intense electromagnetic field. When you pump enough energy into air, it glows. This is real physics. You see it in lightning, in arc welders, in Tesla coils. The fog grew thicker. It started enveloping the entire ship. Visibility decreased. Sailors on nearby vessels reported seeing the Eldridge becoming harder to see, like it was being swallowed by the greenish mist. This part is actually plausible. Create a dense enough ionized field, and you could obscure visual observation without true invisibility. But then, the story claims something else happened. The ship began to fade. The outline became less distinct. You could see through parts of the hull to the water beyond. The superstructure became translucent. And then, with a flash of brilliant light that reportedly lit up the entire shipyard, the Eldridge vanished. gone. Just empty water where a destroyer escort used to be. The mooring lines that had been holding the ship were still there, hanging slack over empty dock space. The water was disturbed, rippling, like something large had just pushed through it. But no ship. The observers on shore allegedly panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd expected radar invisibility, maybe some visual distortion. Not complete disappearance. Not this. The project director, whoever he was, started shouting orders. Shut it down. Reverse the field. Bring it back. Meanwhile, according to the legend, something even stranger was happening in Norfolk, Virginia. Sailors at the Norfolk Naval Base reported seeing a ship materialize out of nowhere in the harbor. The USS Eldridge, clear as day, floating where no ship had been seconds before. It was there for maybe 15 minutes, visible to multiple witnesses, before it vanished again with the same greenish flash. When the Eldridge reappeared in Philadelphia, that's when people realized something had gone horribly wrong. The ship was there, physically present, but damaged in ways that made no sense. Scorch marks on the hull that hadn't been there before. The deck plating was warped in some sections. But the real horror was the crew. Men were screaming. Some were on fire, but it wasn't normal fire. It was described as a cold flame that didn't consume but still burned. Others were embedded in the ship's structure. Not like they'd been crushed or welded, but like matter had merged with matter. A sailor materialized with his hand fused into a steel bulkhead, the metal and flesh seamlessly joined. Another had his legs merged with the deck plating. The lucky ones, if you can call them lucky, were simply unconscious or violently ill, vomiting, disoriented, unable to speak coherently. Their eyes had a 1,000-yard stare, like they'd seen something that broke their minds. Some never recovered. They spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric facilities, muttering about green fog and spaces between spaces. The medical team that rushed aboard found scenes that would haunt them forever. Men phasing in and out of visibility, screaming as they flickered between existence and non-existence. Sailors with burn marks that penetrated deep into tissue but left no entry wound, like they'd been burned from the inside out. Equipment fused together in impossible configurations as if the molecular bonds had been rearranged at random. The official response was immediate and absolute. The experiment was shut down permanently. The equipment was dismantled. The Eldridge was cleared of all experimental gear within 24 hours. The crew was split up and reassigned to different ships, different units, different parts of the Navy where they couldn't compare notes or tell their story together. And most importantly, everyone was told to forget it ever happened. Sign the papers. Take the oath. This is national security. You talk, you're committing treason. Your families will be told you died in combat. You'll spend the rest of your life in military prison. Got it? Good. Dismissed. According to the conspiracy theories, this is where the cover-up began. But here's the thing about cover-ups. They only work if everyone stays quiet. And someone didn't stay quiet. Someone, 12 years later, would write a letter that would blow this whole story wide open. Or create the biggest hoax in naval history. Depending on who you believe, what allegedly happened in the days and weeks after October 28th is where the Philadelphia experiment story goes, from maybe possible to absolutely horrifying. Because if the experiment happened, the immediate aftermath was just the beginning of the nightmare. The sailors who were physically injured, the ones fused into the ship's structure or suffering from mysterious burns, were reportedly evacuated to a secure medical facility. Not a regular naval hospital where too many people might ask questions. A secure facility. Some researchers claim it was Bethesda Naval Hospital. Others say it was a classified medical research center connected to the Manhattan Project. The doctors who examined these men had no frame of reference for what they were seeing. How do you treat someone whose molecular structure has been merged with steel? How do you explain burns that penetrate through muscle and bone but show no entry point? These weren't injuries from any known weapon or accident. This was something new. According to the legend, several sailors died within days. Not from their physical injuries necessarily, but from what we might now call dimensional instability. They'd phase out of existence and never phase back in. Just gone. Empty clothes in a hospital bed. Or they'd materialize inside a wall or floor and die instantly. The human body can't coexist with solid matter, but the psychological trauma was equally devastating. The men who'd been on the Eldridge during the experiment couldn't articulate what they'd experienced. It wasn't just that they'd teleported or become invisible. According to their fragmented testimonies, they'd experienced something outside normal space-time. They described seeing multiple realities simultaneously, being in Philadelphia and Norfolk and nowhere all at once. Time moving in the wrong direction, cause and effect becoming meaningless. Imagine trying to maintain your sanity after experiencing that. Your brain evolved to process 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension, moving forward at a steady rate. What happens when that breaks down? When you experience 4-dimensional space? 5 dimensions? When your consciousness exists in multiple locations simultaneously? Some of the crew allegedly developed a condition that would come to be known as the freeze. They'd be walking down the street doing something normal, and suddenly they'd freeze in place. Not paralyzed, but frozen in time. Visible, but unreachable. Other people would walk past them, maybe not even notice. Then minutes or hours later, they'd unfreeze, completely unaware that time had passed. Even more disturbing were the reports of sailors spontaneously combusting during shore leave. Not the mythical spontaneous human combustion that's been debunked 100 times, but something different. They'd be sitting in a bar or restaurant, seemingly fine, and then they'd start glowing. That same greenish luminescence from the experiment. Within seconds, they'd be consumed by cold flame. The kind that doesn't generate heat but still reduces a human body to ash. Witnesses would describe it as watching someone burn in reverse, turning into light, and then disappearing. Now here's where we need to pause and acknowledge how insane this sounds. People don't spontaneously turn into light and vanish. That's not how physics works. Matter is conserved. You can convert it to energy, but that's nuclear fission, not electromagnetic field effects. If sailors were actually combusting like this, they'd be leaving behind radiation that would be easily detected. There's no evidence of that. But multiple sources tell versions of this story. Are they all lying? Are they repeating the same false narrative? Or did something happen that we can't explain with current physics? The Navy's response to all of this, allegedly, was to classify everything at the highest possible level, above top secret. The documents were locked away. The witnesses were scattered and silenced. The Eldridge itself was scrubbed clean of any experimental equipment and sent back to regular convoy duty like nothing had happened. The ship's captain, Sidney Sherby, was reassigned. The officers who'd overseen the experiment were transferred to classified projects or quietly retired. The civilian scientists who'd designed the equipment disappeared from public record. It was a total information blackout. But you can't completely erase 186 men. Some of them would eventually leave the Navy. Some would die in combat in other engagements. Some would come home, try to rebuild their lives, and carry the secret to their graves. But a few would eventually talk. The problem with traumatic experiences is that they don't stay buried forever. Decades later, men who'd been young sailors on the Eldridge would wake up screaming, reliving that moment when reality broke. Their families would hear fragmented stories about green fog and ships disappearing. Some would seek therapy and spill secrets to psychiatrists who didn't know what to make of these accounts. And then there were the anomalies in the official record. The USS Eldridge's deck logs for October 1943 exist. They show the ship in the Bahamas. But researchers who've examined these logs note irregularities. Different handwriting on different days. entries that seem too detailed or too vague, the kind of inconsistencies you'd expect from documents that were created after the fact to fill in a gap. Moreover, several crew members from the Eldridge who served in 1943 have refused to discuss that period of service, not because they didn't remember, but because they signed legal documents swearing them to secrecy. Even decades later, even after retirement, they felt bound by those oaths. When researchers tracked them down and asked about October 1943, the response was always the same: "I can't talk about that." The Navy's official position has been consistent. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. It's a hoax. There was no invisibility research, no teleportation, no catastrophic accidents. The USS Eldridge was never in Philadelphia during the alleged experiment date. The ship's logs prove it. Case closed. But then why did the Navy feel compelled to issue multiple official denials over the decades? Why release statements specifically debunking a story that, if it were complete fiction, should have died out naturally? Why assign historians to research and write reports proving the experiment didn't happen? That's a lot of effort to debunk something that supposedly never occurred. The cover-up, if there was one, was almost perfect. The evidence was destroyed, the witnesses were silenced, and the official record was sanitized. It would have remained buried forever except for one thing. A drifter with a typewriter decided to write some letters, and those letters would ensure that the Philadelphia experiment would become legend. 12 years after the alleged experiment, in 1955, a man calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende wrote a series of letters that would transform the Philadelphia experiment from a buried military secret into public mythology. And this is where the story gets really weird, because Allende is either the most important witness in modern history or one of the most successful hoaxers ever. Allende's letters were sent to Dr. Morris K. Jessup, a respected astronomer and UFO researcher who just published a book called The Case for the UFO. Jessup's book argued that UFOs were real and that their propulsion systems might be based on Einstein's unified field theory. It was the kind of book that attracted attention from both serious researchers and cranks. Allende's first letter arrived with no return address. The writing was rambling, poorly spelled, full of capital letters for emphasis and bizarre punctuation. It read like something written by someone either extremely disturbed or extremely desperate to be taken seriously, or both. In this letter, Allende claimed to have witnessed the Philadelphia experiment firsthand. He said he'd been a sailor on the SS Andrew Furuseth, a merchant vessel that happened to be docked near the USS Eldridge on the day of the experiment. He described seeing the Eldridge disappear and reappear. He mentioned the greenish fog. He claimed to have later met crew members from the Eldridge who told him about the horrific aftermath. But here's the kicker. Allende provided specific details: names of sailors, dates of events, technical descriptions of the equipment. Either he'd somehow gained access to classified information about a top-secret military experiment, or he was an incredibly creative fiction writer, or he was relaying something he'd actually seen. Jessup was skeptical but intrigued. He wrote back asking for more information. Allende responded with even more letters, each more bizarre than the last. He claimed the experiment had been based on Einstein's unified field theory. He said the Navy had achieved results beyond their expectations and had been terrified by the outcome. He mentioned that some crew members had gone insane, others had vanished completely. Most disturbingly, Allende described the sailors who developed the freeze. He called it Hell Incorporated. He wrote about men who would become invisible at random, unable to control it, sometimes getting stuck halfway between visible and invisible. He mentioned sailors who'd been permanently affected by the experiment, living with its consequences for years. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the ravings of a mentally ill person, you're not alone. Jessup's first impression was that Allende was disturbed. The letters showed signs of paranoia, grandiosity, and possible schizophrenia. The claims were extraordinary, and Allende provided no hard evidence. No photographs, no documents, no witnesses who could corroborate his story. But then something strange happened. In 1956, Jessup received a package from the Office of Naval Research. Inside was a copy of his own book, The Case for the UFO. But this copy had been heavily annotated in the margins by 3 different people using different colored ink. The annotations were bizarre, discussing aliens, secret technology, and the Philadelphia experiment in detail. They were written in a similar style to Allende's letters. The Office of Naval Research wanted Jessup to examine the annotated book and determine who wrote the annotations and whether they represented a security threat. Think about that for a second. The Office of Naval Research, the same organization that would have overseen electromagnetic research during World War II, was showing interest in a book about UFOs and the Philadelphia experiment. Why? Jessup met with naval officials. They asked him about Allende, about the letters, about whether he thought the claims could be true. Jessup was non-committal, but expressed interest in investigating further. The Navy thanked him, and the meeting ended. Here's where conspiracy theories really take off. Some researchers claim the Navy was testing Jessup, trying to determine how much he knew and whether he was getting too close to the truth. Others argue the Navy was genuinely trying to debunk the story and wanted Jessup's help identifying the source of the rumors. Still others think the whole thing was a psychological operation, an experiment in information warfare and public perception. What we know for certain is that Jessup became increasingly obsessed with the Philadelphia experiment. He tried to track down Allende but found it difficult. Allende had given different names, moved around frequently, and seemed to deliberately cover his tracks. Jessup did manage to identify Allende's real name, Carl Meredith Allen. Born in Pennsylvania, drifted through various jobs, served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. Jessup interviewed other sailors who'd served on the SS Andrew Furuseth, trying to corroborate Allende's claims. None of them remembered the Philadelphia experiment. Some didn't even remember Allende. But merchant marine crews changed frequently, and not everyone would have been on deck during an alleged experiment. The lack of corroboration didn't necessarily disprove the story. Allende himself remained elusive. He'd occasionally surface to write another letter, usually to refute something Jessup had written or to add more details to his original story. But he refused to meet in person. He wouldn't provide documentation. He claimed he was scared of the Navy, that they were watching him, that revealing too much would put him in danger. This behavior is classic for either a genuine whistleblower or a hoaxer. Genuine whistleblowers are paranoid because they have reason to be. They've seen what happens to people who talk. But hoaxers are also paranoid because they need to maintain the fiction. They can't meet in person because face-to-face contact might reveal the lie. They can't provide documentation because it doesn't exist. So which was Allende? The evidence is mixed. On one hand, he did serve in the Merchant Marine during World War II. He could have been in Philadelphia. Some of his technical descriptions of naval equipment are accurate for the period. He correctly named some officers and crew members from the Eldridge, information that wasn't easily accessible in 1955 before the internet. On the other hand, he was demonstrably mentally ill. Later investigations revealed that Allende had been hospitalized for psychiatric issues. He had a history of fabricating stories and seeking attention. His letters contained factual errors and timeline inconsistencies that suggest he was either confused or making things up. The most damning evidence against Allende came decades later when researchers tracked him down. In interviews, an elderly Carl Allen admitted that he'd exaggerated parts of the story. He claimed he'd heard rumors from other sailors and embellished them. He said he never actually saw the Eldridge disappear. The whole thing was based on overheard conversations and his own imagination. But even then, he maintained that something had happened, that the Navy had conducted electromagnetic experiments on ships, that there had been accidents, that the core of the story was true, even if his specific claims were not. He was recanting, but not completely. Denying, but still hinting. So we have a mentally ill witness with a history of fabrication who admits to lying, but insists there's truth beneath the lies. We have the Navy showing unusual interest in his claims. We have missing documentation and silenced witnesses. And we have Morris Jessup, the researcher trying to sort truth from fiction. Jessup, who would soon be dead, in circumstances that would add yet another layer to the conspiracy. On April 20th, 1959, Dr. Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car in Dade County, Florida. The official ruling was suicide. Jessup had been depressed, had financial problems, had recently divorced. He'd attached a hose to his car's exhaust pipe and run it through a window, filling the vehicle with carbon monoxide. His death was tragic, but seemingly straightforward. Except nothing about the Philadelphia experiment is ever straightforward. In the weeks before his death, Jessup had told friends he was close to a breakthrough. He'd been researching the Philadelphia experiment intensively, following up leads, connecting dots. He claimed he had new information that would prove the experiment had occurred. He was planning to publish a new book that would expose everything. Then he drove to a park, wrote a suicide note, and killed himself. Or did he? The conspiracy theories around Jessup's death focus on several anomalies. First, the suicide note was vague, not specific to any particular problem in his life. It read like a generic note someone might write if they were faking a suicide. Second, Jessup had been in good spirits according to some friends, making plans for the future, not exhibiting typical suicidal behavior. Third, he'd told multiple people he felt he was being followed and threatened, that powerful forces wanted him to stop investigating. Moreover, Jessup had been scheduled to meet with a researcher the day after his death. This researcher, Dr. Valentine, claimed Jessup had called him days earlier, saying he had explosive information about the Philadelphia experiment and needed to discuss it in person. Jessup never made that meeting. The police investigation was cursory. Suicide seemed obvious. No foul play suspected. Case closed. But later analysis of the scene raised questions. The hose connection was sloppy. Not the kind of careful setup you'd expect from someone who wanted to ensure death. There were bruises on Jessup's body that weren't explained. And some of his research materials were missing from his home, never recovered. Was Jessup murdered to silence him? Or did he simply succumb to depression and financial stress? We'll never know for certain. But his death ensured that the most credible researcher investigating the Philadelphia experiment would never publish his findings. After Jessup's death, interest in the Philadelphia experiment waned for years. Allende disappeared from public view. The story became a footnote in UFO literature, mentioned occasionally, but not seriously investigated. It might have stayed that way except for two things: the countercultural revolution of the 1960s and the increasing declassification of World War II secrets. In the 60s and 70s, people were primed to believe the government was lying about everything. Vietnam, Watergate, CIA mind control experiments like MK Ultra, which turned out to be real. Suddenly, the idea that the Navy had conducted dangerous experiments and covered them up didn't seem far-fetched. It seemed entirely plausible. Researchers began digging into the Philadelphia experiment with renewed interest. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests. They tracked down surviving crew members from the USS Eldridge. They examined ship logs, naval records, testimony from other sailors who'd been in Philadelphia during World War II. What they found was fascinating. The Navy had indeed conducted electromagnetic experiments during the war. Degaussing was just the beginning. There were projects researching radar jamming, electromagnetic pulse weapons, and radio frequency interference. Some of these projects were highly classified. Some remain classified even today. They also found that naval accidents during World War II were often covered up or misreported. Sailors died in experimental weapons tests, in equipment malfunctions, in classified operations. Their deaths were attributed to enemy action or generic line of duty causes. The Navy had a long history of secrecy around anything that might damage morale or reveal technical capabilities to the enemy. So the infrastructure for a cover-up absolutely existed. The will to maintain secrecy was proven. The technical capability to conduct electromagnetic experiments was documented. But did they conduct the specific experiment described by Allende? That remained unproven. One researcher, Robert Gearman, did something smart. Instead of trying to prove the Philadelphia experiment happened, he investigated Carl Allen himself. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? What was his background? Gorman tracked Allen down in Pennsylvania in the early 1980s. Allen was living a quiet life, working odd jobs, mostly staying out of trouble. In interviews, Allen was cagey about the Philadelphia experiment. He'd tell different versions of the story depending on his mood. Sometimes he claimed he'd made the whole thing up. Other times he insisted it was true but exaggerated. Still other times he hinted at even more incredible details he'd left out. Allen admitted to having mental health issues. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He acknowledged that some of his letters to Jessup had been written during manic episodes when he wasn't thinking clearly, but he maintained that the core of the story, that the Navy had conducted invisibility experiments with terrible results, was based on things he'd heard from other sailors. So was Allen a fabricator? A mentally ill man who created an elaborate fantasy? Or was he a genuine witness whose mental illness made his testimony unreliable? Or something in between? Someone who'd heard real stories and embellished them into something more dramatic? The problem with witness testimony, especially decades after an event, is that memory is unreliable. We know from psychology research that memories can be false, implanted, distorted by suggestion. Allen had read about UFOs, Tesla, Einstein, naval technology. His brain could have woven together real information with fictional elements into a coherent narrative that felt true to him. But the details he got right, the specific names and dates he provided, those suggest he had some genuine information. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. But Allen was right about a lot of things that a random drifter shouldn't have known. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. Jessup was dead, potentially silenced. Allende was unreliable but insistent. The Navy denied everything but showed suspicious interest. And underlying it all was the tantalizing possibility that something, even if not exactly what was claimed, had actually occurred. But the story wasn't over. In the 1980s, the Philadelphia experiment would explode into popular culture and spawn a new generation of investigators. In 1984, everything changed. Charles Berlitz, the author who'd made Roswell and the Bermuda Triangle household names, published The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. The book was a bestseller, presenting the story as factual history with only minimal skepticism. Berlitz was a master of the genre, blending documented facts with speculation so seamlessly that readers came away convinced they'd learned secret history. That same year, Hollywood released a movie called The Philadelphia Experiment, starring Michael Paré. The film took the basic premise, a warship accidentally transported through time, and turned it into a science fiction adventure. It was successful enough to spawn a sequel and later a remake. Suddenly, millions of people had heard about the Philadelphia experiment, and many assumed it was based on true events because the movie said it was. This mainstream attention had two effects. First, it brought in serious researchers who'd previously dismissed the story as fringe conspiracy theory. Scientists, historians, and journalists started investigating with fresh eyes. Second, it attracted even more conspiracy theorists and fabricators who added their own invented details to the growing mythology. The serious researchers made some important discoveries. They confirmed that the USS Eldridge was indeed in the Bahamas during late October 1943, not in Philadelphia. The ship's deck logs, multiple naval records, and testimony from crew members all agreed. The Eldridge was not physically present in Philadelphia on October 28th. This seemed to debunk the entire story until someone pointed out that the Navy had more than one Eldridge. Not officially, but nickname-wise. Several destroyers and destroyer escorts had unofficial names or numbers that might have been confused over the decades. Could the experiment have been conducted on a different ship that someone misremembered as the Eldridge? Other researchers focused on the technical aspects. Dr. Mark Seifer, a Tesla biographer and electrical engineer, examined whether Tesla's work could have contributed to invisibility research. Seifer concluded that Tesla's rotating magnetic field theories had no application to optical invisibility, and that any claim of Tesla's involvement was posthumous attribution without evidence. Jacques Vallée, a computer scientist and UFO researcher with a more skeptical bent, investigated the entire story from a sociological perspective. He argued that the Philadelphia experiment was a modern myth, a story that people wanted to believe, because it confirmed their suspicions about government secrecy and advanced technology. Vallée didn't claim it was a hoax exactly, but rather a collectively constructed narrative built on fragments of truth, misunderstanding, and deliberate fabrication. But then came the anomalies. Researchers discovered that several crew members from the actual USS Eldridge, the one that was in the Bahamas, had refused to discuss their service during specific periods in 1943 and 44. Not the whole war, just specific months. When pressed, they'd cite security oaths they'd signed that were still binding. Security oaths that were still binding 40 years later? For routine convoy escort duty in the Bahamas? That struck researchers as odd. The Navy declassified most World War II information by the 70s. What were these sailors sworn to secrecy about? One crew member, Edward Dudgeon, became the most vocal debunker of the Philadelphia experiment. He insisted he'd been on the Eldridge the entire time, that no experiment occurred, that the ship never went to Philadelphia. Dudgeon was interviewed multiple times, gave consistent testimony, and seemed like a credible witness. But even Dudgeon admitted to gaps in his memory, periods where he couldn't account for every day, times when the ship's location seemed unclear. He attributed this to the chaos of wartime service, memory fading over decades. Fair enough. But some researchers noted that his certainty about what didn't happen was stronger than his certainty about what did happen, which is psychologically unusual. The Navy, for its part, released an official statement in 1996 titled The Philadelphia Experiment. The statement flatly denied that any invisibility experiments were conducted on the USS Eldridge or any other vessel. It explained degaussing technology and clarified that this was the extent of electromagnetic research on ships. It attributed the entire legend to Allende's fabrications and subsequent fictional elaborations. This should have ended it. Official denial, lack of physical evidence, discredited witness, case closed. Except the statement did something interesting. It spent several pages explaining in detail why the experiment couldn't have happened, providing technical reasons, logistical reasons, and testimony from naval historians. That's a lot of effort for something that supposedly never occurred. Moreover, the statement was carefully worded. It denied invisibility experiments on the USS Eldridge. Very specifically, it didn't address whether electromagnetic experiments beyond standard degaussing were conducted on other vessels. It didn't discuss classified projects that might have involved electromagnetic field research. The denial was specific, not comprehensive. This kind of careful language is typical of government statements about classified programs. They deny the specific claim while avoiding broader statements that might be proven false if classification levels change. It's neither confirmation nor complete denial. It's maintaining plausible deniability. Meanwhile, in the background, legitimate electromagnetic research was advancing in ways that made aspects of the Philadelphia experiment story seem less impossible. Stealth technology was declassified in the 80s, revealing that the military had indeed been working on radar invisibility for decades. Quantum mechanics was suggesting that teleportation of information was theoretically possible. High-energy physics was exploring dimensions beyond the 3 spatial and 1 temporal that we experience, None of this proved the Philadelphia experiment happened, but it demonstrated that the military does conduct research into seemingly impossible technologies, does achieve breakthroughs that remain classified for decades, and does occasionally have catastrophic accidents that are covered up. The best modern example is MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control program. For years, claims about MK-Ultra were dismissed as conspiracy theory. The CIA denied everything. Then, in 1975, documents were declassified revealing that MK-Ultra was real, had conducted horrific experiments on unwitting subjects, and had been covered up at the highest levels of government for decades. If MK-Ultra was real, why couldn't the Philadelphia experiment be real? That became the reasoning of believers. The government lies, conducts unethical experiments, and covers them up. It's been proven. Therefore, any claim of secret military experiments deserves at least consideration. But here's the fundamental problem. Just because the government has lied before doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true. Some stories are just stories. Some witnesses are unreliable. Some claims are physically impossible regardless of government secrecy. So where does that leave us with the Philadelphia experiment? With a final look at what we can actually verify versus what remains pure speculation. All right? Let's strip away the mythology and look at what we can actually verify. What pieces of the Philadelphia experiment story are documented fact? What pieces are plausible speculation? And what pieces are complete fantasy? Documented facts. 1. The USS Eldridge existed. It was commissioned August 27, 1943. It was a Cannon-class destroyer escort. It served in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. It was eventually transferred to Greece and renamed Aetus. All of this is in the official naval record. 2. Degaussing was real and widely used. Wrapping ships in electromagnetic coils to neutralize magnetic signatures was standard practice. The Navy had extensive research programs on electromagnetic applications during World War II. None of this was secret or controversial. 3. Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, was a real person who served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. He did write letters to Morris Jessup describing the Philadelphia experiment. Those letters exist and have been examined by researchers. Allen's mental health issues are also documented. 4. Morris Jessup did receive the annotated copy of his book from the Office of Naval Research. That book exists. Jessup did meet with naval officials to discuss it, and Jessup did die in 1959 under circumstances ruled as suicide. 5. The Navy has consistently denied that any invisibility experiments were conducted on the USS Eldridge or any other vessel. Multiple official statements have been released over the decades reiterating this denial. Those are the facts we can prove. Everything else falls into varying degrees of speculation. Plausible speculation: the Navy may have conducted electromagnetic research beyond standard degaussing. Given the wartime pressure to develop new technologies and the massive investment in research, it's entirely plausible they experimented with radar jamming, electromagnetic pulse effects, and other applications of high-power electromagnetic fields. Such experiments may have had unexpected or dangerous side effects. Early radar operators sometimes reported feeling sick or disoriented when near high-power transmitters. Electromagnetic fields can affect human biology, causing nausea, headaches, and in extreme cases, more serious health issues. If the Navy was experimenting with extremely powerful fields, health effects would be expected. Some of these experiments may have been classified and remain so. The Navy has acknowledged that many World War II projects remain classified for various reasons, including ongoing relevance to current technology or diplomatic sensitivity. Not everything has been declassified. Accidents may have occurred that were covered up to protect morale and maintain secrecy. The Navy absolutely did cover up accidents during the war, when revealing them would damage confidence or reveal technical capabilities. This is documented in other contexts. What strains credibility? The claim of optical invisibility. There is no known physics that would allow a ship to become optically invisible using 1940s technology or even current technology at that scale. The energy requirements alone would be impossible to generate with any naval vessel. The claim of teleportation. Moving a 1,200-ton ship instantaneously across 200 miles violates multiple physical laws. Even if somehow possible, it would release energy equivalent to several nuclear weapons and would be impossible to hide. The claim that sailors were fused into the ship's hull. This would require matter to interpenetrate at the molecular level, something that doesn't happen even in the most extreme electromagnetic fields. It's science fiction, not science. The claim of spontaneous combustion, or the freeze. While electromagnetic fields can affect human biology, they don't cause people to burst into flames or freeze in time. These effects have never been observed in any legitimate scientific context. Alternative explanations. Theory 1. Nothing happened. Carl Allen fabricated the entire story, possibly due to mental illness, possibly seeking attention. Jessup was gullible and spread the story before realizing it was false. The Navy denied it because it was false. End of story. Theory 2. Something small happened that got exaggerated. Maybe the Navy did conduct electromagnetic experiments that caused some health effects or equipment malfunctions. Allen heard about it, embellished the details, and over time the story grew into the legend we know. The Navy denies it because acknowledging any part would validate the mythology. Theory 3. A classified experiment occurred that had nothing to do with invisibility or teleportation. But Allen witnessed something he couldn't explain. Maybe a new weapon system, a submarine launch, a sonar test. Something that from a distance looked inexplicable. He interpreted it through the lens of the science fiction he'd read, and the legend was born. Theory 4. The experiment happened essentially as described, but the Navy successfully covered it up except for a few witnesses who couldn't keep quiet. The denials are lies, the documentation was destroyed, and we'll never know the full truth unless classification levels change. Which theory is correct? Based on the evidence, theory 2 or 3 seems most likely. Something probably happened, but nowhere near as dramatic as claimed. The human mind is pattern-seeking and story-creating. Give someone an unexplained observation, add some scientific concepts they don't fully understand, mix in government secrecy, and you get a legend. But here's what's interesting. Even if the Philadelphia experiment, as described, never happened, the story tells us important things about human psychology and government-citizen relationships. We want to believe in secret advanced technology because it's more exciting than the mundane reality of incremental progress. We want to believe the government is lying because sometimes they are, and previous lies make us suspicious of all official statements. The Philadelphia experiment has also influenced real science. Researchers working on metamaterials and optical cloaking openly cite the Philadelphia experiment as inspiration, even though they know it's probably fiction. The story sparked imagination that led to actual technological development. That's the power of a good story, even a false one. And maybe, just maybe, there's a kernel of truth buried under decades of embellishment and fabrication. Maybe the Navy did try something ambitious, and it failed. Maybe a few sailors saw something they couldn't explain and told their friends. Who told their friends? Who told Carl Allen? Maybe the truth is stranger than we think, but not as strange as the legend. Here's the final mystery. Why do we need this story to be true? What does it say about us that we find the idea of impossible military experiments and government cover-ups more compelling than the likely reality that a mentally ill man made up an elaborate story? And why does the Navy keep denying it if it's so obviously false? Sometimes the questions are more interesting than the answers. So where are we now, 80 plus years after the alleged experiment? The USS Eldridge has long since been scrapped. The men who might have been aboard that day, real or imagined, are dead. Carl Allen passed away in 1994, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave. And yet the story lives on, stronger than ever in some ways. The Philadelphia experiment has become a cultural touchstone. It's referenced in movies, TV shows, novels, and video games. It's taught in media literacy courses as an example of how legends are created and spread. It's cited by conspiracy theorists as proof of government malfeasance, and it's studied by sociologists interested in how modern myths form. The story has also had real impacts on research. The concept of electromagnetic cloaking, once pure science fiction, is now a legitimate field of study. Researchers at Duke University created the first optical cloaking device in 2006, using metamaterials to bend light around an object. It only worked at microwave frequencies and could only hide objects a few inches across, but it was proof that the basic concept was sound. Stealth technology, which makes aircraft invisible to radar, was developed starting in the 1970s and declassified in the 1980s. It uses shaped surfaces and radar-absorbing materials rather than electromagnetic fields, but the goal is the same: invisibility to detection systems. The military did eventually achieve a form of invisibility, just not the way the Philadelphia experiment claimed. Quantum teleportation, the transfer of quantum states between particles, has been demonstrated in laboratories. It doesn't involve moving matter, only information, and it can't be used to teleport macroscopic objects. But 50 years ago, even this would have seemed impossible. Physics advances in ways that make yesterday's impossibilities tomorrow's achievements. So could the Philadelphia experiment have happened based on 1940s technology? No. The claimed effects violate known physics and would require energy generation capability that didn't exist. But could the Navy have attempted something ambitious, achieved partial success or unexpected failure, and classified the results? Yes, that's entirely plausible. The most likely scenario, in my opinion, is this. The Navy conducted electromagnetic research beyond standard degaussing. They tested powerful field generators on ships, probably for radar jamming or submarine detection purposes. Some of these tests had unexpected side effects, health impacts on crew, equipment malfunctions, maybe even some visual distortions from ionized air. Carl Allen witnessed something related to these tests, possibly from a distance where he couldn't see clearly. His mind filled in the gaps with science fiction concepts popular at the time. He wrote to Jessup, exaggerating what he'd seen and heard. Jessup, excited by the implications, publicized the story. The Navy, embarrassed by whatever had actually happened, issued blanket denials rather than explaining classified research, and over time, the story grew into the legend. But here's the thing, even if that's true, it doesn't make the story less significant. The Philadelphia experiment represents something important about the relationship between citizens and government, between public knowledge and classified secrets, between possible and impossible. We live in an era where the government does conduct classified research, does develop weapons and technologies without public knowledge, and does occasionally cover up accidents or failures. The line between conspiracy theory and eventually revealed truth is thinner than we'd like to admit. MK Ultra was a conspiracy theory until it wasn't. COINTELPRO was paranoia until documents proved it was real. The Tuskegee experiments were unthinkable until they were acknowledged. So when someone claims the Philadelphia experiment happened, they're not just claiming a specific historical event. They're claiming a worldview where the government lies, where advanced technology exists in secret, where the official narrative can't be trusted. And given history, can we really blame them for that skepticism? At the same time, not every conspiracy theory is true. Not every claim of government cover-up is valid. Not every witness is reliable. Critical thinking requires balancing healthy skepticism of authority with intellectual honesty about evidence. The Philadelphia experiment probably didn't happen as described, but something happened. The story came from somewhere, and our fascination with it says something about human nature, our need for mystery, our desire to believe in the impossible. The unanswered questions remain. What exactly did Carl Allen see, if anything? Why did the Office of Naval Research take such interest in an annotated book about UFOs? What experiments was the Navy conducting that required security oaths, binding sailors to secrecy for 40-plus years? What happened to Morris Jessup, and was his death truly suicide? Why do the USS Eldridge's deck logs show those irregularities researchers noted? Maybe someday classification levels will change, and documents will be released that answer these questions. Maybe a deathbed confession from some retired naval officer will shed new light. Maybe technological advances will make clear what was possible in 1943 and what wasn't. Or maybe the truth is already known, and we just don't like the answer, that a troubled man made up a compelling story, and we believed it because we wanted to. The legacy of the Philadelphia experiment isn't about whether invisibility and teleportation are possible. It's about how we create meaning from ambiguity, how we construct narratives from fragments, and how we decide what to believe when evidence is incomplete. It's about the power of a good story to capture imagination and persist across generations, regardless of truth. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment is less about physics and more about psychology, less about what the Navy did in 1943, and more about what we need to believe is possible. It's a mirror reflecting our hopes that revolutionary breakthroughs are happening in secret, our fears that those breakthroughs might be dangerous, and our certainty that we're not being told the whole truth. And you know what? We're probably right about that last part. We're never told the whole truth. The question is whether the truth involves teleporting warships and sailors fused into steel, or something more mundane and disappointing. I know which one I'd rather believe, but belief and truth aren't always the same thing. So what do you think? Did the Philadelphia experiment happen? Is Carl Allen a hero whistleblower or a disturbed hoaxer? Should the Navy declassify everything related to World War II electromagnetic research? Let me know in the comments what you believe and why. If you enjoyed diving deep into this legendary mystery, hit that like button and subscribe for more investigations into the strange, the secret, and the supposedly impossible. Because whether the Philadelphia experiment was real or not, the story certainly is. And stories like this are why we keep searching for truth in a world of secrets. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and remember, just because something sounds impossible doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it also doesn't mean it did.